Okay, perfect. So let's kick off. And I think Andrew, Thomas, anyone else that sort of jumps in, very, very happy for you to sort of interrupt as we go along if you do have any clarifying questions. I think the idea for today's webinar is to give everyone a little bit of background into doing business in Australia, what sort of economy it is in order to conduct business across various industries, and some of the benefits available primarily around some of the government incentive schemes. So before we kick off, a large part of our business, in fact, is inbound in terms of in terms of UK and Europe. We have clients who are headquartered in Ireland, Spain, Switzerland, Germany, France, a number of different jurisdictions that way, where they set up entities in Australia either to enhance their commercial operations globally, but quite often to take advantage of our generous R&D tax incentive, which we'll go into shortly. So good timing for Yen to join just as we kick off. And I think what I should hope in terms of the learnings to come out of today. So benefits of conducting business in Australia, a little bit of information around the R&D tax incentive and some of the benefits available in that respect. Structuring and establishment in terms of how you actually set up a business in Australia and some of the requirements around that. Periodic and annual compliance in terms of lodgements and so on. And then a 10-step case study, which is based on one of our Swiss clients that has an Australian subsidiary in the biotechnology space. So I will say that most of the clients that we've seen sort of expanding into Australia have primarily been from life sciences and from technology is typically the two sectors that we see the most inbound activity. However, that's not to say that there are others that are looking at that space, but certainly in the SME segment, which I think most of our firms represent, we find that most are technology and biotechnology related. So kicking off with benefits, and like I said, please feel free to interrupt at any point and ask any questions as we go. So some of the benefits in Australia, it's an overall quite an affluent market, being a first world country. The median income is quite high comparative to many other parts of the world, and therefore the capacity to invest both at a government standpoint in terms of our tax rates being quite reasonable at the corporate level, in that there's there were historically 30% corporate tax in Australia, but there's a plan within the next decade to bring that down to 20%, and we're already about almost halfway there. So FY22 will be down to 26, and then it slowly, gradually will come down to 20% over the next decade. Having said that, earnings here are quite high. People do quite well. The cost of living is also high, of course, and so as a result of that, there is quite a large middle market, and as such, the SME sector in Australia is very, very strong. We have a very well-regulated corporate and financial market, so instances of fraud, instances of any sort of corruption and so on are quite rare and few and far between. And so we do have an excellent corporate and financial market that allows businesses here to operate relatively smoothly. It is also a politically and economically stable market, being one of the lowest budget deficits amongst first world countries. And we also have access to Asian markets and time zones, being where we are. So a lot of our clients operate across Singapore, Hong Kong, China, and certainly in Southeast Asia and Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and so on. And I think given the boom in sort of outsourcing that we've experienced over the last 5 to 10 years in particular, that a lot of Australian companies have seen the benefit of being within this time zone in accessing some of that labor in some of those jurisdictions. There's certainly been an innovation boom, is probably the best way to say it here in Australia, in terms of the move from more traditional industries where Australia's wealth was created, which was primarily around resources/mining and property, and very much a move towards technology, sciences, and other STEM-related sort of fields. It's something that's probably taken a little bit longer in Australia than most other places, and I think there has historically not been a huge amount of government support in these areas, but the R&D tax incentive is certainly one of the preeminent and as far as I'm aware, the largest benefit for R&D activities globally, in fact, compared to any other jurisdiction. So it is the most generous is what we are told. We're also, a very well-educated workforce and extremely culturally diverse. Australia is certainly a country of immigrants. You can take, say, my business partner and myself as an example. I'm an immigrant from Kenya with an Indian background, and Said is of Iranian background, both having come here around 30 years ago, over 30 years ago now. So certainly a very culturally diverse place. Everyone in Australia is seen to have a fair go in starting a business and trying to create some success for themselves, and that's been great. Probably one of the other, I guess, more recent benefits of conducting business in Australia is has been Australia's response to COVID-19. I think we went into lockdown relatively early in the piece and was able to stem a lot of the infection rates here in Australia. And what it's actually meant is that we've seen an increased amount of investment into Australia, primarily in the life sciences sector. And this wasn't always obvious, but became quite obvious a few months ago. In that patient recruitment in Australia is at an all-time high because there is availability in hospitals to house patients. So because we have the facilities available to actually conduct clinical trials here in Australia, we're seeing a lot of biotech companies set up in Australia in order to not have to sort of stall on their side of things to actually undertake clinical trials. And so we're seeing a lot of companies from Europe and the US in particular looking to set up Australian subsidiaries with a view to conducting clinical trials here in Australia, and therefore claiming the R&D tax incentive that comes associated with that. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as well. So I think the R&D tax incentive, being the main focus of today's discussion, the Australian government, it's quite obvious what the Australian government is trying to achieve when it comes to the R&D tax incentive. They are trying to fuel innovation in a country that has historically been built on mining and resources and property previously. And as those industries start to come off, they're looking to infill the excess talent in Australia with, this generous government grant to facilitate innovation here in Australia. So if you have turnover, so if you have revenue in your group of less than 20 million Australian dollars, the benefit is up to 43.5 cents in the dollar in cash. So it's a refundable tax offset. So let's say, for example, you're a company, you're a life sciences company is a good example. You have zero revenue in that you're in the drug development phase, or you might have some small licensing revenue, for example. You set up a company in Australia, you conduct a clinical trial, and you spend $1 million in a financial year, and you have no revenue in the Australian entity, the Australian tax office will cut you a check for $435,000 in cash. So that can obviously then be used to repatriate back overseas. It can be, and like I think the hope is obviously that that's continued to be reinvested in Australia. And there are a number of regulations that sit around that in terms of eligibility, where it needs to be for the creation of new knowledge. There needs to be an unknown outcome associated with undertaking the activities. So more broad-based sort of innovation principles. And if you think about what it takes to get a patent, for example, it's a very similar sort of frame of thinking in terms of eligibility for the incentive. So certainly very, very innovation focused. If your group has over $20 million in aggregated turnover globally, then you receive a 38.5% non-refundable tax offset. So what that means is you receive 8.5 cents to 11 cents in the dollar, because what the tax offset is calculated as the amount quoted that you can see on the screens, 43.5 or 38.5, less the corporate tax rate. The differential between the two is the true net cash benefit, except in the refundable circumstance, you actually get to cash out the whole tax deduction as well. So as you can see there, 8.5 cents to 11 cents reduction in tax payable for every dollar of R&D expenditure. And on the left side, maximum 43.5 cents cash back for every dollar of R&D expenditure, where your turnover threshold is under $20 million. So for small to medium enterprise, which in Australia is defined at around that $20 million turnover mark, a very, very generous government benefit that's being provided, and something that we see a substantial take up primarily in technology, life sciences, engineering, and manufacturing are probably the four sectors where we see the most take up in that respect. So the phases of an R&D tax incentive claim are here in 4 phases. So the way in which we work here is there's the identification of projects. There's then the preparation of technical documentation, which is effectively an R&D project report detailing the project objectives, detailing the new knowledge and the unknown outcomes as we discussed. And then importantly, the actual activities themselves, the actual experimentation that's been undertaken in respect of a project. Phase 3 is in the calculation of R&D expenditure, and then phase 4 is the lodgements phase of, from the Oz industry standpoint, which is the governing body from the technical standpoint of the grant, is an application for registration of R&D activities. And then the ATO side is the R&D schedule, which goes into the annual income tax return. Once the income tax return is lodged, then your benefit is realized, whether that's the cashback or whether it's a reduction in tax payable. Is everyone sort of pretty clear on that so far? Yeah, thank you. Great. So eligibility, like I said, is almost solely based around the definition of a core R&D activity. So I'll say the legislative definition, for argument's sake, but really it's focused around new knowledge and innovation. But a core R&D activity is an activity that proceeds for the purposes of new knowledge and moves from hypothesis to experiment, observation, and evaluation, leading to a logical conclusion. So quite a scientific definition, in fact, and the reason, and because of the scientific nature of this grant, our R&D tax incentive team are actually all scientists and engineers. They're not accountants, which is quite unique here in Australia. So a lot of R&D tax incentive teams are formed with scientists and engineers, whereas obviously accounting and tax teams are typically chartered or certified practicing accountants. So core R&D activity is the basis upon an eligible R&D claim and what forms eligibility for a company here in Australia. A supporting R&D activity is anything that must occur in order for the core R&D activity to occur. So what that means, for example, is if you do market research, you spend time talking to customers, relatively kind of routine activities that then drive the basis upon which you undertake the core activity, that is then claimable for R&D tax incentive purposes at the same rate as a core R&D activity. And like I said, so the core and supporting activities, they both receive the same level of offset. So the main categories of R&D expenditure, and this is always a popular question, is what can I claim if I come to Australia? If I undertake R&D activities in Australia, what can I actually claim in terms of costs? So the main categories are contractor costs. So in the case of the life sciences example that I gave before, CRO or clinical research organization, invoices related to onshore clinical trials here in Australia. Salaries and wages, including on costs. So you capture a percentage of time of people's time and apply that to salaries and wages and bring that into the claim. Direct costs such as travel, in a post-COVID world, and any other sort of R&D specific costs that can be allocated, and overheads, things like rent, electricity, any other utilities, and so on and so forth. You claim a percentage of those as well. And one, I guess, it's not claimed as often, but often feedstock. So in a manufacturing process, any kind of inputs that go into the process can also be claimed, even if they result in a saleable output, as well as depreciable assets. So any depreciable assets, if it's used in the R&D process, you can claim a percentage of that as well. So some important considerations is the structuring of IP ownership if the activities are conducted in Australia is actually not particularly relevant. A lot of people say, well, if I undertake activities in Australia, but then, I own my IP in the Spanish head company, for example, then, how does that actually impact my ability to claim in Australia? So long as the importance of the R&D tax incentive from an eligibility standpoint is where the activities are being conducted. They must be being conducted in Australia. And the reason for that is, if the tax office is going to give away 43.5 cents in the dollar on one side of the coin, they want to make sure that they're collecting their 27.5 on the other side. So if you obviously are engaging an offshore contractor and claiming 43.5 cents in the dollar, and there's no income tax pickup for the Australian tax office on the other side, then obviously that's not something that they're going to accept. I will talk about that third dot point because that's quite important in respect of the point that I just made. Because a lot of other jurisdictions have either March year ends or 31 December year ends and so on, Australia has a system where you can actually substitute the accounting period of the subsidiary entity to match its head company. So what it means is, dependent on the time of the year, you may be able to do an initial claim for a short period of say 4 or 5 months, and then substitute the accounting period and do another claim for the next 4 or 5 months thereafter, and therefore achieve 2 R&D tax incentive claims within the initial 12-month period, or potentially slightly more than 12 months. So depending on the timing of incorporation and the timing of commencement of R&D activities, there is potential to claim twice within a 12-month period. The overseas finding process is a special process within the law that allows Australian companies to claim on activities conducted overseas. What that means is you need to be able to justify to Oz industry why you had to go overseas in order to claim the R&D activities there. So some of the reasons are things like quarantine. Some of the things are access to facilities, access to specific personnel, climatic conditions. So for example, down here in Australia, if you wanted to test a Wi-Fi router in extreme cold scenarios and, in temperatures of -10, -20 degrees, we don't get that in Australia. And therefore, that's a reason why you must go overseas to conduct testing on this device, because you simply can't do it here. And that would be a valid reason to apply for an overseas finding and claim some of your overseas costs for Australian R&D tax incentive purposes. The deadline for lodgement of Australian activities is 10 months following year end. So if your year end is 31 December, then your deadline is 31st of October the next year. And if your deadline is, if your year end is 30 June, which is the Australian default year end, then your deadline is 30th of April the following year thereafter. There is typically no extensions provided for that. So it is quite a hard deadline. However, with the right amount of planning, it's never been much of an issue for us or our clients. So that's kind of a high-level background into the incentive, the benefits available, and so on. And I should have noted this earlier, but I will send a PDF of these slides across to Andrew following the call, and very happy for it to be distributed to all participants. So no issue there. So in terms of structuring and establishment, phase one is in terms of setting up an Australian entity. So the company incorporation process includes registration with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, the document preparation, so company constitution, shareholder register, share certificates, and appointment minutes, all relatively common and standard. Registration of an Australian business number and tax file number. And then typically, because most of our overseas clients won't have boots on the ground here in Australia, is one of our partner team will act as the resident director and public officer of the newly incorporated company in Australia. So obviously we're indemnified against any risk in that respect, and the decisions are made at the head company level. But in order to incorporate a company in Australia, you must have a resident director, and that's a service that our firm provides. And as we talked about before on the substituted accounting period point, you can then synchronize the Australian entity's year end to that of the overseas headco, and that's something that we see quite a lot of as well. Phase three, often audit, as we all know, is an important compliance cost that a lot of entities incur. Where the Australian entity has only sort of expenses being incurred, there isn't a huge amount of revenue, and dependent on the size of its operations, you can apply for audit relief in Australia. So that excuses the Australian entity from its audit obligations, which are often imposed on foreign controlled companies as required. The head company may require it by volition of their shareholders or otherwise, but there is an application for audit relief that can be lodged to get you out of that. We then seek to establish an Australian bank account in the name of the newly incorporated entity. We are having some trouble with that at the moment because of the virus, in that if there are multiple directors of the Australian company, then getting a foreign director to come into the branch here in Sydney is quite challenging at the moment, as you can imagine. And so what we're typically doing is setting up the company with a sole director to begin with, get the bank account opened, and then add on the foreign directors thereafter. So we have found a way to sort of work around that and ensure that we stay, within anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing laws, which are being taken very seriously here in Australia. And then phase 5 is the setup of Xero, our preferred cloud-based accounting package. Xero, I believe, is beginning to make its expansion into Europe, but it's definitely the preeminent product here in Australia, become fast growing in US and the UK as well. But it's a very, very sort of simple product to operate, and it allows everyone to sort of have access, as I'm sure the cloud-based packages that you use across the UK, Europe, and in other jurisdictions as well. Okay, so moving into annual compliance. So once established, the annual activities sort of include, monthly bookkeeping, key accounts and bank balances, as we all know plenty about, electronic lodgement of the quarterly GST/sales tax return. So what that is it's a quarterly lodgement. The sales tax rate in Australia is 10%. So let's say, for example, you're quoted by a CRO $1 million to conduct a phase 1 trial here in Australia. That invoice would have GST applied to it, and therefore would be 1 million plus 10% of GST or sales tax. And then what happens is quarterly, you get to claim that 10% back, and it's paid in cash. So it's meant to be a tax that's imposed on the end consumer, not a business to business tax, unless you're in financial services. So that's more of a cash flow timing thing, in that yes, you have to pay it up front, and only once you've actually incurred the cost can you then claim the credits back. And so that's an important part of the law here. And then, of course, the electronic lodgement of an annual financial statements and company tax return, which is done on an annual basis. A successful R&D tax incentive process, actually ends up with a schedule that goes into your tax return, and only upon lodgement of that do you then realize the benefit. Okay, so we'll run through a quick case study, and then I'm happy to sort of field any questions after that. So we're a Swiss-based entity entering Australia. We, incorporated the Australian entity with ASIC, registered the ABN and TFN. They were here conducting clinical trials. We appointed a resident director, substituted accounting period to align 31 December as their year end, which is the Swiss sort of default year end. Applied successfully for audit relief, so that there were no there was no audit required for them on a periodic basis, and set up a bank account with Westpac, which is the bank that we deal with most here. The accounting software and chart of accounts was all set up within Xero. Access provided, to all the foreign personnel that were relevant for the Australian entity. And then we conducted bookkeeping on a monthly basis, lodged the quarterly return in order to yield back the benefit. And we then prepared and lodged 2 R&D tax incentive claims, and then another 4 annual claims thereafter. So they sort of had 6 successful R&D tax incentive claims before they wound up their trials in Australia, repatriated the excess cash back to Switzerland, and wound up the Australian entity. So a very, very successful entry into Australia, good results in their trials. And then when they were done with the entity, wound it up and repatriated the excess cash as a return of capital back to the Swiss headco. And that was that. So it was a very, very smooth process with them. They received in excess of $4.5 million in R&D refunds from the Australian government. They were subject to a review at the end of the second year, which all went swimmingly. There was no issues there at all. And so, for setting up an entity, which was relatively straightforward, engaging a CRO here to undertake clinical trials, and then spend approximately $9.5 million in total. Then, around 4.5 of that came back in R&D tax incentive claims. Some of it was then reinvested further into Australia, which you can then claim on again, of course, and some was repatriated back to Switzerland. So that's really, I think, the sort of high level, ladies and gentlemen, on sort of doing business in Australia. The R&D tax incentive in particular being quite a generous sort of government scheme that's in place. The recent budget announcement in Australia mean that for FY21, instead of 43.5, you can actually receive 44.5 for 1 year percent cents in the dollar, and then it will revert back to 43.5 cents in the dollar thereafter. But look, very, very happy to field any questions. And like I said, I will certainly send the slides around to Andrew. And if anyone that is either here with us today or is watching the recording at a later point, my contact details are here on the next slide, and very, very happy for you to reach out and ask any questions as you see fit. I have a lot more hair in that photo, you'll notice as well.
Thanks, Samir. Excellent.
Pleasure.
The hair may be just a glitch of Zoom meetings. We don't know. Me too. I'm actually bald.
Yeah. I wish. I've seen your hair in the flesh, and it's real.
Well, fantastic, excellent. Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone else has got some questions.
I do have some curiosities. For how long is this regime going on in Australia?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the R&D scheme in Australia has been around actually since 1986. But it wasn't a refundable scheme at that point in time where you could actually receive cash back. It changed from the R&D concession to the R&D tax incentive and became refundable in FY12. So the first year was the year ended 30 June 2012, and it's been a consistent scheme since then. So it's been around now for 8 years. We've been using it consistently over that period for our clients. Most of our clients are in technology and life sciences and manufacturing engineering. We don't have many clients in the more traditional Australian industries. So yeah, it's been very successful for our clients.
Yeah, and the way it works, I mean, if I understood it correctly, the amount I invest into R&D, I can ask for a refund, a percentage of the refund. But does that implies that I mean, is it possible to have this expense deducted? I mean, carried forward for the future income, or I am substituting the refund in exchange for this possibility of carrying forward?
Correct. So in the absence of an R&D claim, any expenses incurred that result in tax losses are carried forward to offset against future income. Very, very similar to your system in Spain, Thomas. So what happens with the R&D tax incentive is you forego that tax deduction in order to receive the R&D benefit. So to give you some numbers around that, the current tax rate for companies with 20 million and under is 27.5 cents in the dollar, 27.5%. So the additional R&D benefit is 16, which gives you the 43.5. So what happens is you are foregoing the 27.5% tax deduction to carry forward in order to receive a 43.5% refundable cashback amount.
Okay, understood. And is there any, I mean, those are the incentives for the research. Is there any like patent box return for the royalties or for this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So look, the Australian R&D incentive is our leading sort of system here to encourage innovation. The patent box scheme, obviously, from the UK in particular, has a great reputation, has done wonderful things for the economy there. It is something the Australian government has considered, but there isn't anything immediate around putting in place a patent box scheme or anything along those lines just yet. So this is the R&D incentive is kind of what they really hang their hat on, so to speak, and is certainly the one which they push the most. The other, which is another, is the export market development grant. So it's less for inbound businesses, but more focused on outbound. So if you're spending money on flights and accommodation and trade shows and overseas sales personnel, or you're bringing people to Australia to see your product, et cetera, then you can claim up to 50% of those expenses as well. That has a number of limits and so on that apply to it. So it's not as lucrative as the R&D tax incentive typically, but that is another popular scheme in Australia.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay, guys. I mean, I think unless anyone has any further questions, like I said, I will distribute the slides around to Andrew. Very happy to share this recording, and look forward to seeing it go live. And any questions, I'd love to hear from you.
Okay, thanks. Just for Tom, if you're listening, I think you joined there just at the end. I'm sharing the video on an unlisted YouTube later on today, probably when that gets processed. And also I'll make a summary and share that on the TGS Hub along with your presentation, Samir.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for hosting, Andrew. Thank you very much for organizing this. And I really enjoyed that. It was nice to meet you all.
Well, thank you. That's fantastic. These are great opportunities to mix people up a little bit, and it'll develop some more conversations around it, no doubt.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Wonderful. Well, thanks everyone. Have a wonderful
Thank
day.
you, Samir.
Thank you.
And I'll have a wonderful night. Take care. See you guys.
Bye, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.